So, today on the podcast, we start our monthly news stories. We have one long article today that covers a number of projects and concepts, and next week we'll have a handful of shorter articles about a range of issues. But as for today, let's set it up like this. Over the last few weeks, we have looked at Disney's history with mini parks and regional installations proposed for the U.S. and elsewhere. Most of these weren't built, and those that were built largely didn't lead to long-term ongoing success. But now, in 2025, in the themed entertainment business, we're about to see a wave of experimental new theme parks from large entertainment companies that fall under the same category: smaller regional parks with top-shelf IP. This week we'll take a look at what Universal is doing with a couple of small parks that they're about to open, though there are some interesting movements from other companies that we'll touch on next week. The big questions that we have for today are: how do Universal's new regional offerings change the theme park landscape in the U.S.? How will they affect Disney's plans moving forward? What exactly are they offering? What are the likely barriers to these new Universal Parks' success? And with certain and soft political notes mixed into their development plans, how might these modest Universal Parks remake the battleground between Universal and Disney? But before I get to all of that, I need to thank another round of Bandcamp subscribers. If you're a regular listener here, you already know that we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. I'm grateful to all of our subscribers over on Bandcamp because they keep this whole enterprise going. But today, a special note of thanks is going out to new subscribers: the 1000th Ghost, WED 1923, HM Gabe, CPT Whizbang, Eric, and Calvin. Thanks to each of you for supporting all we do here. And now, let's click in to the show. Let's begin here with some interesting shifts in the North American theme park market, specifically the competitive ongoing dance that is being played out between Universal and Disney. And to talk about these shifts, we're going to have to put them in context. Specifically, we need to talk about some elements of game theory. We've already talked about game theory on our podcast before and how it relates to theme park competition, but it's been a while, like 5 years. I think the last time we brought up this topic was as America moved out of COVID lockdowns. At that time, we looked at theme park marketing strategies through the lens of game theory. In Florida during the summer of 2020, as both Disney World and Universal Orlando looked for ways to fill their parks, Universal had a strategic advantage because they made the first move to identify their mid-COVID market. To be effective, Universal and Disney ideally needed different strategies, and Universal, as they opened first, got to define their strategy before Disney did. It worked like this. Among American theme park fans, there are some who will almost always choose Disney, and there are some who will almost always choose Universal. So this type of marketing is most influential with undecided guests or guests without a deep preference who can be swayed by benefits. Universal back in 2020 was the first to reopen, the first to market, so it could choose the strategy that it felt would best support its business model through that difficult time. Universal chose to present themselves as the value option. Florida residents back in the summer of 2020 could buy a one-day ticket to both Universal parks for $165, which then also included unlimited visits to both parks through the end of the year, which was roughly 6 months. So, essentially, an unlimited 6-month pass for $165. Universal offered many other value tickets, such as buy 2 days, get 3 free for anyone visiting their parks no matter where they lived. This substantially reduced the per-day cost to visit the Universal parks. Both Disney and Universal knew that the value strategy was most effective if only one of the two major resorts engaged it. If Disney also heavily discounted tickets for locals and traditional tourists, Universal would gain nothing, as available visitors were essentially split between the two resorts. If that happened, all Universal gained was to needlessly let a lot of guests in for a heavily discounted price. And Disney would be left chasing Universal's value audience. Universal had the greatest win if it was able to draw potential visitors away from Disney through pricing. There's only so much theme park pie, and Universal only increased its potential theme park audience if it took some of that pie away from Disney. Through lower pricing, particularly on that unlimited use ticket, Universal drew a significant number of potential guests over to its resort to spend time in its parks, restaurants, and stores, where no doubt these guests spent some more money. This plan also increased the overall number of locals attending the Universal theme parks. But there was a cost to this value strategy. Most of these guests had heavily discounted tickets. For guests with a $165 unlimited pass, if they visited Universal Parks 6 times in 6 months, the cost of a single visit, amortized over those 6 months, was roughly $27. After the pandemic was over, it would be difficult to convince these same guests that a single visit to Universal should now be valued once again at $165. If Disney then also used the value-centered approach to marketing, it would go after guests who had already shifted over to Universal. After all, how many theme parks can a tourist visit on one vacation or a local visit within 6 months? Simply, it's usually less effective to chase after a marketing trend and an established audience than it is to define a different or neighboring audience that might better relate to a sales strategy different from that of competitors. And this is exactly what happened. Disney didn't present itself as the value option. It instead presented itself as the premium vacation and theme park experience. It maintained far higher price points than Universal, which preserved the quality perception of its parks. It did offer locals 4 visits to the Disney parks for $200, which was a slightly better deal than similar offers that they had made in previous summers, but not outrageously better. For example, right now in 2025, Florida residents can get a 4-day ticket for $240. The ticket deals at Universal, however, were substantially better. But outside of this, Disney held on to traditional pricing for its parks, despite a drastic reduction in services. Ideally, this would allow Disney to move back into a better market position once the pandemic ended and the parks returned to somewhat normal operations, as heavily discounting never happened at its ticket booths. In June 2020, when all of this was going on, everyone was taking their best guess as to how long COVID would last. No one really knew. The Disney model would be better if the pandemic was short, lasting a few months, as it did reduce some possible visitation during the pandemic in exchange for more profitable visitation after the pandemic was over. The Universal model would be better if the pandemic was longer, with a significant delay to normal guest visitation cycles, as Universal was pointedly trying to capture more of the local audience who didn't need to get on a plane to visit their parks. In this, ultimately, Universal was the winner. On both sides, there was some educated guessing going on, but no one knew exactly what the future would hold. But to boil all of this down to a takeaway point for our episode today, during the first summer of the pandemic, we saw the 2 largest theme park companies in America move through marketing decisions that, in a way, highlighted elements of game theory. Specifically, that comparable companies had the least to gain if they marketed their products in similar ways to a similar audience, or in this case, if they both went after the value segment, thereby splitting that audience. And they typically had the most to gain if they fashioned unique messages that targeted different audience segments with slightly different strategies. And yes, this certainly doesn't account for all marketing strategies, but it's often the most effective marketing strategy. For example, I've recently seen ads for the soon-to-be-opened Epic Universe, particularly for the Isle of Berk, that are clearly pitched towards Disney fans who often visit the Disney parks when they're in Florida. These ads feature the meet and greet area with the dragon Toothless in such a way that they mimic the character meet and greets that are far more central to the Disney experience. Universal is essentially saying, come over to this new park because there are some Disney-like elements over here as well. But then there's this question. How much does Universal need to spend on ads to convince a Disney fan to come over to Universal versus how much do they need to spend on ads to convince guests without a strong park preference to come to Universal this summer? Now let's take this idea over to one trend I see going on in the Universal sphere right now. And this has to do with game theory, regional parks, and political identities. And before I jump in here, let me say again that I have no interest in turning this into a political podcast. We only talk about politics when it's deeply relevant to our discussion of the Disney company or its competitors, such as with that ideological battle between the governor of Florida and Disney CEO Bob Chapek a few years ago. I would like this podcast to be a place where everyone feels welcome, where for a short time each week we focused on those interests that unite us together, not those things that divide us. That is, I'd like this podcast to be a welcome break from some of the struggle that's out there in the rest of the world right now. And in the section that follows here, I'm only talking about marketing as it relates to political demographics, not political opinions or the nuances of political ideologies. Now let's step over to this space in terms of how the public views American entertainment conglomerates. Whether Disney intended for this to happen or not, I couldn't tell you. But during the last 5 years, Disney has been at least publicly perceived as a left-center-leaning company. This was particularly true after that ideological dispute between Bob Chapek and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. I do think that the actual political identity of the Disney parks is far, far more nuanced than this, with both right and left-leaning elements working together. For example, I'd be really hard-pressed to find any attractions at any theme park that spoke more directly to patriotism and a sense of American exceptionalism than the Hall of Presidents and the American Adventure at Disney World. But all of that aside, the popular and deeply entrenched cultural view right now, especially after that battle with DeSantis, is that the Disney company is center-left, which has caused some potential customers who are center-right to be more hesitant about booking a trip to Disney, as they might feel that their political beliefs are different than that of the company. Add into this some other things. The 3 main regions where one might experience Disney installations are all center-left regions. First, Southern California. Southern California was not always left-leaning. In the 1950s, when Disneyland opened, California was far more politically mixed. 58% of the voting population back then were registered as Democrats, but the majority of elected state officials were Republicans. Simply, voters in the 1950s weren't tribal. They didn't vote as an ideological group. They voted more on the strengths and weaknesses of each candidate rather than on party affiliation. But this changed through the 1970s and 1980s with the state shifting left. As of today, the last time California voted for a Republican president was 1988 with Ronald Reagan. The second area is Central Florida. I should point out that overall, Florida is a purple state. The last 3 presidential elections, Florida has voted for the Republican candidate, but in the two before that for the Democrat, making it a purple swing state. But in the Central Florida region, specifically the Orlando, Kissimmee, Sanford metro area, the public leans more toward Democrats. Even though the overall state went Republican in the last election, 55.3% of the people in the greater Orlando area voted Democrat, while 43.4% voted Republican. And that left skew is common in Central Florida. The last region that is home to a reasonably large and stable Disney installation is Disney on Broadway in New York. New York has skewed left for decades. At the moment, all of the North American Universal parks also exist in those same regions that are presently center-left leaning, Southern California and Central Florida. But Universal has recently announced 2 regional parks. Both of them seem clearly positioned as feeder opportunities to introduce visitors to the Universal experience. One park, sort of a permanent Halloween Horror Nights on the small scale, will be in Las Vegas opening this summer. The other, a 32-acre Universal Kids Park in Frisco, Texas. This is about 30 miles from Dallas on the upper outskirts of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. To be honest, from the start, that Las Vegas mini park made perfect sense to me. There are 2 basic ways to make a park successful. First, you create a regional park like Disneyland that is reliant on new or rotating experiences, such as rides, parades, stage shows, special events, and nighttime spectaculars, to continually lure back people who live in that same region. Or second, you position a park in an area where there's a continual stream of new tourists coming in, so new offerings every quarter don't matter as much. These resorts need major attractions every couple of years to bring back tourists, but no one for these tourist-centered areas is realistically hoping that a large number of out-of-town guests will visit multiple times each year, which is more of a Disneyland pattern, not a Disney World pattern. Las Vegas fits this second model perfectly. A small horror mini park has no realistic hope of long-term survival if it relies largely on locals for visitation throughout the year. But in a city that already sees an endless wave of new tourists every few days, it at least has the potential to do just fine, presenting the same 4 mazes to a new set of tourists each day. There are some hurdles for that Las Vegas Horror Unleashed park, but we'll get to them in a bit. Frisco, Texas, on the other hand, home to the forthcoming Universal Kids Resort, was a little more puzzling for me. From a pure economic standpoint, there are far more attractive urban areas without cinema-centered theme parks to target in terms of families with disposable income, also with deep population levels that would provide more customers for such a park. And there are cities that presently attract more tourists than the Dallas-Fort Worth area. But all of those cities with higher wealth, population, and tourism levels would again place the Universal Park in or near a center-left metropolis. So if a company wanted to quietly gesture that their theme park was more open to a right-center audience by placing one of their parks in a center-right location, then your 3 best economic and population areas are Houston, San Antonio, and Dallas in that order. All of these locations are reasonably drivable from Frisco, Texas. It's a little over 4 hours away from both Houston and San Antonio, and it's about a half hour from Dallas. Likewise, if you were primarily looking for cities with high levels of existing tourism to support this park, you would place this park someplace other than Frisco, Texas. But with just one exception, the top 10 American cities in terms of tourism levels are all center-left cities, such as San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, and so on. Though one exception in the top 10 list is Las Vegas, which probably isn't an ideal place for a kids' park. Also, Universal is already putting one small installation there. If one point of these regional installations is to create feeder experiences that eventually drive more guests to Universal Orlando, it would be sort of pointless to have the first two feeder experiences in the exact same city. But once you remove the highest 10 cities for tourism again, all except for Las Vegas, center left, you quickly come across Houston at number 11 and Dallas at number 14. Universal Kids is not a destination resort. That is, very few people will likely book a trip to Texas specifically to visit this 32-acre park, but it should pick up some tourists who happen to be in the region anyways. Again, if an ideological consideration was part of your equation, the lower half of Texas suddenly makes a lot more sense than it would otherwise. If your criteria was primarily focused on pure economics, tourism patterns, and population levels without any ideological consideration, you'd put that park elsewhere. But once you remove left-center-leaning regions from both of these lists, this part of Texas suddenly becomes the optimal place to build such a park. And I would lay money that these observations are very, very close to conversations that occurred inside of a Universal Creative Planning unit. Of course, this will never be part of the public conversation, but as we discussed earlier with that example from the pandemic, game theory suggests that it's far more difficult to chase after an existing company's audience than to court a neighboring audience segment with a slightly different message. If the public presently perceives that Disney is center-left friendly, then Universal would be financially incentivized to quietly suggest that they are more welcoming to a center-right audience while also signaling that they are open to all guests as well. Neither company wants to be associated with a right or left stance. Just take a look at Tesla for how overt political signaling can backfire in terms of company sales. So this is a difficult line for Universal to walk. It would be advantageous for Universal to subtly and very quietly suggest that though they are officially politically neutral, they are more welcoming to a center-right audience than other parks, especially for those guests who feel ideologically distanced from Disney. Or the question might be put this way: how can Universal court ex-Disney fans who might have political issues with the company while not alienating center-left potential customers at the same time? But that, I'm pretty sure, is part of the marketing calculus for these two regional Universal projects, namely to accept that there are now elements of political tribalism in America that partially shape a group's spending dynamics, and if the perception is that Disney is slightly more associated with one tribe, even though Disney wants to self-identify as politically neutral, then it would be advantageous for Universal to quietly gesture an openness to the other tribe, which seems to be what is happening here by regional placement. As I mentioned, both Central Florida and Southern California are center-left, but the placement of both new Universal installations are in regions that are definitely not center-left. Nevada is a true purple state. In terms of political elections, in 2024, Nevada voted Republican. In 2020, it voted Democrat. And Texas is center-right. In presidential elections, it hasn't voted for a Democrat since 1976. But in this strategy, there's also a reasonable amount of risk, as it's very difficult for companies to gesture to one political tribe without offending the other. Regional placement is a very soft note, but I do suspect there are notes like that here, an interesting gamble in terms of branding, and there could be a large payoff here as well, as there are tens or even hundreds of thousands of disaffected ex-Disney fans who have left the Disney sphere for political reasons but still enjoy theme parks. Just enough of a nudge here from Universal, without it being so loud as to appear overtly political may help shift some of these ex-Disney fans over to Universal, just as Universal is also suggesting that their trio of parks in Florida now offers a viable option to the Disney resort. And some of the paths towards that Universal Orlando resort are through experiences being built in Vegas and Texas. The Universal installation in Las Vegas is a true mini park at 2.5 acres, but the Children's Park in Texas at an estimated 32 acres is a small regional park. Both are clearly designed to offer a sampling of the Universal experience, ideally to eventually move interested guests over to a Universal Orlando vacation sometime in the not-too-distant future. I expect there will be some elements of advertising at Horror Unleashed in Las Vegas for the Orlando experience. Something along the lines of, if you enjoyed these 4 horror mazes here today, there will be 10 new mazes at Halloween Horror Nights in Orlando this fall. Also, the park in Texas is clearly arranged to acculture kids to the characters that Universal owns or licenses. So instead of meeting Mickey, Minnie, Chewbacca, and R2, they would meet SpongeBob, the Minions, Shrek, and the Trolls, again with signage promoting even larger experiences in Orlando, especially as young families age out of the Universal Kids Park in Texas and look for experiences that might better speak to tweens and teens. So in this, I'm seeing some subtle counter-programming moves that I've not observed before with large American themed entertainment players. There is definite risk in these moves, but it will be interesting to see if the concept of feeder experiences located far from Orlando, also with placement in non-center-left regions, provides a noticeable bump in visitation for Orlando Universal in the years to come. And now that we've looked at some of the underlying strategies for these parks, I do want to dip down into some of the interesting design elements that have been announced for these Universal regional parks since the last time we talked about them a few months ago. Based on acreage, the Universal Kids Resort in Texas should accommodate about 20,000 visitors on peak days, though it is expecting to see about 7,500 on a typical weekday. And in terms of percentages, the swings here are actually larger than at the Magic Kingdom. The Magic Kingdom can accommodate about 90,000 guests on peak days, but sees about 45,000 on a typical weekday. And for transparency here in 2025, those weekday numbers may actually be a little lower. But what this says here is that families will take time off work and school to visit the Magic Kingdom, as there is only a 50% differential between peak and average weekday attendance, while the percentage gap between peak and average weekday projections is far greater for the Universal Kids Resort, as the park is expecting fewer people to take time off from work or school to visit. The resort will initially have a 300-room hotel, which also tells you that the park is expecting the vast majority of its customers to drive there and then drive home. Knott's Berry Farm in California is a good comparable model here. Knott's Berry Farm is larger at 57 acres, but other key factors here are similar. Knott's as well can hold about 20,000 guests, but has under 10,000 guests on a typical weekday. Knott's, too, has one on-property hotel, which has 322 rooms. The vast majority of Knott's visitors are SoCal locals, which means that the park doesn't need a large number of hotel rooms to support on-property stays. Visitation patterns for that Texas park are probably going to be similar to Knott's Berry Farm, which is definitely a regional park. The Texas park will have 7 themed areas: a Shrek area with a swamp-themed playground, a Puss in Boots area, a Trolls area featuring a music festival, a Minions hub area with some water play elements, a Jurassic World area key to the animated spin-off for kids Camp Cretaceous, the Bikini Bottom world of SpongeBob, and an area themed around the kids' TV show Gabby's Playhouse. In terms of rides, not everything has been announced, but based on the Bird's Eye concept map, there appears to be a Troller coaster and a Trolls-themed balloon ride similar to Emotional Whirlwind at DCA. There appears to be a Camp Cretaceous family-friendly coaster, a Puss in Boots chair swing ride, an Autopia-style ride through Shrek's Swamp, and in the Jurassic Park area, what in the murky art looks to be a short drop tower or possibly a pod adaptation of a Ferris wheel. In the SpongeBob area, there will be a spinner ride like Dumbo, as well as something that looks like a teacup ride. In the Minions Hub area, there will be a boat ride on a watercourse that moves through most of the park. One of the big things that I can't fully identify are show buildings for classic dark rides, like Peter Pan's Flight or something more ambitious like Ariel's Undersea Adventure. From that bird's eye map, there's clearly a large building in the Puss in Boots area that could support a substantial dark ride, but the structure could be for something else, like a stage show, a 3D film experience, or even a fairly large table service restaurant. There's a slightly smaller building over in the SpongeBob area with a giant pineapple out front. This could also be a dark ride, perhaps the rumored ride where young guests earn their boating licenses. Again, all this is based on the scant artwork that has been released, and as any theme park fan knows, a whole lot can change between early concept art and opening day. But this is a true kids park, with all of the rides there geared towards younger visitors. Over in Las Vegas, there will be 4 themed mazes in the Horror Unleashed park. One of the interesting elements here is that these mazes are permanent, unlike those at Halloween Horror Nights in Orlando and in California, which are put up and removed each year, which means that in Vegas, Universal Creative might be able to lean into more expensive effects and perhaps even some upper-end animatronics. There are 4 themes: Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Exorcist Believer, that's the Blumhouse version of Exorcist, Universal Monsters, which means the monsters from the 1930s catalog films such as Frankenstein and Dracula, and an original offering, Scarecrow the Reaping. And along with this, there'll be dining and shopping with everything under a single roof. The installation will open in a few months on August 14th, which is also when many regional haunted houses open for the Halloween season, which will likely help this Vegas mini park see strong attendance numbers at least until November. The park is only open 5 days a week, which likely means that Universal's Horror Unleashed offerings will be relying on one group of scare actors who work full-time shifts from Thursday to Monday, with the whole experience closed on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Pricing for the experience is interesting and a bit of a gamble, I would say. There are 2 basic options: one ticket that allows entry to each of the 4 mazes once. These tickets do start at $69, but most days are $79 or $89 at least during the opening months. The other ticket offers unlimited visits to each of the 4 mazes. These tickets start at $99, but most days are priced between $129 and $149. The pricing here, I would say, is somewhat aggressive, especially considering that Halloween Horror Nights last year in Orlando with 10 mazes, various scare zones, stage shows, and some of the regular daytime attractions operating started at $82.99 and topped out at $122.99. So Universal is asking the same or more in terms of price for this 2.5-acre horror experience in Las Vegas as they do for the full Halloween Horror Nights experience in Orlando. Just to put the park size in perspective, The show building for Pirates of the Caribbean in Disneyland is also 2.5 acres. So everything in this new Universal mini park in Vegas, the mazes, the show area, the stores, the bars, and the restaurant would all fit within Disneyland's version of Pirates of the Caribbean. And a one-day admission of $80 to $150 is a lot for a 2.5-acre amusement park. In our recent series on the lost Disney mini parks and regional installations, this was one of Disney's own takeaways from the 1990s. The operational cost to run a modestly sized, high-quality indoor experience may be so high that it could cause potential guests to balk at the ticket price necessary to cover cost and make a profit. This was one of the lessons of the now-defunct Disney Quest indoor offering, where in Chicago, Disney actually had to lower ticket prices a few months after opening. Also, I should point out that at least right now, there is no express option to skip the line at the Vegas park, but with a limited capacity date-based reservation system and an indoor mini park at 2.5 acres, I can't imagine there's actually much room for long queues, so space limitations might have already solved this problem. I would also guess, as the space is so small, Universal might opt for a virtual queue system so they don't need to waste limited floor space to create physical queue areas. The entire Las Vegas experience will be arranged in a building dressed to be a warehouse. In the concept art, there are film reels and boxes that look like prop storage, so maybe this warehouse has a cinematic theme, but maybe the cinematic touches here are for the area around the Universal Monsters Maze, which directly speaks to the history of Hollywood cinema. The artwork's sort of unclear on this. There is one small stage for live actors, and by small I mean the stage is large enough for perhaps 4 or 5 actors. In one piece of concept art, the stage is situated above a bar, and the seating around it is lounge-style tables and chairs, not theater or stadium seating that you find at a full theme park. So there's a place for some small stage production, but nothing as elaborate as the Nightmare Fuel show that Universal has staged in Orlando in recent years. And in the concept art on that small stage is Jack, the iconic clown from Halloween Horror Nights in Orlando, again suggesting that this 2.5-acre experience is designed with some connective links to the larger experience in Orlando. So what we have in all this together is a novel approach to how satellite or regional installations relate to the larger home resort. If you've listened to our recent 6-part series on largely unbuilt or defunct Disney mini parks that ranged from 1939 to 2017, one of the ideas presented in that series, a concept proposed by Disney legend Jack Lindquist in the late 1980s, was to develop a small ship that would travel from port to port around the world as a type of Disney preview center. It would include a couple of smaller attractions to give people the taste of a Disney park and to show the world how Disney parks were different than amusement parks in other countries, with the goal of bringing them to California, Florida, or Japan, as these were the only options back then for a Disney park experience. There's a similar flavor here with Universal's Horror Unleashed park, where guests see a 2.5-acre sampling of the big production that takes place out in Florida. There's also an example from that mini park series that speaks to the Universal Kids Resort in Texas. In 1959 and the early 60s, Walt proposed developing some Fantasyland-style mini parks that would roll out across the country for families with younger children. In part, these parks were proposed because air travel was far more expensive in the early 1960s than it is today. But these mini Fantasylands would serve as introductions to Disney experiences and how the Disney characters are presented in a park situation, so that at some point later in their lives, families might be interested in visiting the larger Disney park in Anaheim. And this is exactly what the Universal Kids Resort is designed to do in Texas. There are also some unique but very soft political overtones to these projects in 2025, likely designed to expand the Universal audience. But the main goal here for the Texas park appears to create a feeder structure to support the overall Universal ecosystem in the States. But in terms of regional parks and mini parks, as well as elaborate preview centers, Disney ultimately decided that none of their efforts were worth the investment. Even when Disney did open Club Disney and Disney Quest in the 1990s, both of them being a series of regional experiences, they simply didn't meet return on investment expectations, meaning that Disney decided that capital investment was better spent on the California and Florida resorts to develop out mass entertainment and destination travel resorts to see a greater financial return. Universal right now is moving in the exact opposite direction. That is, Universal is embracing regional parks where 30 years ago Disney moved away from them. So we'll soon see if these new Universal installations hit Universal's ROI targets or if Universal can justify lower profit expectations if attendance at these regional parks contributes to growing future visitation levels in the Orlando resort. Then again, Universal might actually end up with the exact same answer that Disney arrived at back in the 1990s, that smaller regional offerings aren't the best use of capital investment. And here's what I see as the likely problem points for both of these upcoming Universal offerings. I think for the Las Vegas Horror Park, the largest barrier for success will be the price point. Tickets priced around $100 is on the high end for a 2.5-acre park. And in terms of the Universal Kids Park in Texas, I see repeatability as the largest barrier towards success. Legoland in San Diego, another park directed at kids 12 and under, has a similar market profile. It's a regional theme park for families with young kids with the marketing directed at local regions. But there are about 20 million people who live within a 90-minute drive of Legoland in San Diego, while there are only about 6.7 million that live within a 90-minute drive of the Universal Kids Resort in Texas. Because of the lower population levels around Dallas, Universal is likely looking at repeat business to help fill the park, which may or may not happen. Then again, 2025 is a very different business world than the 1990s, which was when Disney experimented with regional installations and location-based entertainment. So now the answers might be different than those from 3 decades ago. Universal has already indicated that they are considering other regional projects, but those, of course, will only happen if the first 2 are successful. Horror Unleashed opens on August 14th in Vegas. Universal Kids Resort doesn't yet have an opening date, though just before summer 2026 is a good guess. And it will be interesting to see how these parks and some of the underlying identity elements change the overall landscape of themed experiences as we move forward. But of course, we won't have real-world answers to any of these questions for a while. I'll be back next week with a new episode. The plan right now is to continue our monthly news and analysis stories, and there is a lot out there to talk about. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.